You have to understand something about silence before you can understand this story. Not the silence of an empty room. That's nothing. That's just waiting. I'm talking about the silence of a room full of people who are trained to be invisible. That's a different animal entirely. That's a living thing, breathing in the corners, pressing against your eardrums until you can hear your own heartbeat clicking like a watch. That was my world for 12 years. My name is James. I was a footman in the royal household. Not the glamorous one you see on television, the one who rides in the carriage and carries the big velvet cushions. No, I was a junior footman, which meant I stood very still for very long hours. I opened doors at the exact right millisecond, and I learned to pour tea without making a sound loud enough to disturb a sleeping corgi. And I learned to listen. Specifically, I learned to listen for her. Most people think the Queen moved through Buckingham Palace like a ghost. She didn't. She moved like weather. You felt her before you saw her. There's a pressure change in the air, a subtle shift in the way the other senior staff would straighten their spines just a fraction of an inch. But me? I had something better than spines. I had the floor. The corridors in the private apartments are old. Not old like antique. Old like 300 years of footsteps have worn the oak planks into shallow valleys. Certain floorboards sing when you walk on them. Others groan. A few have developed a specific creak that sounds like a duck being stepped on, but don't ever say that out loud because someone will write it down in a notebook and you'll be having a very awkward conversation with the master of the household. The Queen wore shoes that changed everything. During the day, in the palace, she wore these low-heeled loafers. Practical. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The Queen's feet were small. Really small. A size 4, I think. And she walked with a specific gait. Heel first, then a soft roll to the ball of the foot, then a pause. Always a tiny pause, like she was checking the ground was still there. I noticed it my 3rd month on the job. I was stationed outside the audience room, a Tuesday afternoon in October. Rain tapping the windows like nervous fingers. I've been standing there for 2 hours, my legs had gone numb, and my mind was doing that weird thing where you start counting the threads on the carpet just to stay awake. That's when I heard it. Click, pad, pause. Click, pad, pause. Coming from the end of the corridor. Slow, measured, deliberate. I didn't think much of it at first. The palace has dozens of staff walking around. But this was different. This pattern had a weight to it. Not physical weight. I don't mean she was heavy. I mean the footsteps carried authority. Each one landed like a decision. I glanced sideways, not turning my head because turning your head is a sign of curiosity, and curiosity is not a quality they look for in a junior footman. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Queen Elizabeth II. Walking alone. No lady-in-waiting. No protection officer. Just her, a strand of pearls, and a pair of sensible brown loafers. She passed within 3 feet of me. Didn't look at me. Didn't acknowledge me. That was normal. I was furniture. Good furniture, well polished, but furniture nonetheless. She disappeared into the audience room, and the door closed with a soft thump that was quieter than a Bible falling on a pillow. I exhaled, and then I did something stupid. I closed my eyes, just for a second, just to replay the sound in my head. Click, pad, pause. There was something about that pause. It wasn't tired. It wasn't hurried. It was neutral, like a librarian deciding which book to pull from the shelf. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment it started. The obsession. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't help myself. Every time she walked past my post, I listened. I started cataloging her footsteps like a birdwatcher logging species. There was the morning walk, brisk, businesslike, the heel hitting harder than usual, probably because she had a full schedule and a stack of red boxes waiting. There's the afternoon drift, slower, softer, with longer pauses between steps, often followed by the distant sound of a corgi barking, which meant she was heading toward the garden. And then there was the camillia walk. I named it that myself, not because of flowers, but because of the way it sounded. Light, precise, almost musical. She only used this walk on certain days, usually late spring, when the windows were open and you could smell the roses from the Buckingham Palace garden. The camillia walk had a rhythm to it. Top, pause. Top, pause. Like a heartbeat with an extra beat thrown in. I became obsessed with that walk. You have to understand, there's not a lot to hold on to in that job. You stand. You wait. You open doors. You close doors. Your mind starts to wander, and if your mind wanders too far, you make mistakes. I once saw a senior footman forget to bow when the Queen entered a room. He didn't get fired, but he got the look. You know the look. The one that says, I have remembered your name, and not in a good way. So you find anchors, small things to focus on. For me, it was her feet. By the 6th month, I could tell you exactly how far away she was by the volume of the heel strike. By the 9th month, I could tell you if she was carrying anything. A handbag added a slight drag to the left foot. A stack of papers made her step shorter, more careful. By the 1st year, I could tell your mood. And that's when things got strange. It was a Thursday, gray sky, the kind of London day that makes you forget the sun ever existed. I was stationed in the corridor outside the Chinese dining room, which is a terrible place to be stationed because the carpet there is so thick it swallows sound. Most footsteps would be completely muffled, but not hers. Hers cut through like a knife. I heard her coming from 50 yards away. Click, pad, pause, but different. The pauses were longer. The heel strike was sharper, angrier. Not loud, exactly, but pointed, like she was trying to drive each foot into the floorboards. I felt my stomach tighten. She appeared at the end of the corridor, walking fast. Her face was calm. It was always calm, but her jaw was set in a way I'd never seen before. She passed me without a word, entered the Chinese dining room, and closed the door. A few seconds later, I heard something I will never forget. Not shouting. The Queen never shouted, but a voice raised just slightly, carrying through the old wood. She was talking to someone inside. Her private secretary, maybe. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Displeasure. Deep, cold displeasure. I found out later that a foreign dignitary had canceled a state visit at the last minute. Something about a scheduling conflict. But everyone knew the real reason was political. The Queen had been looking forward to that visit for months. She had personally selected the menu, the flowers, the gifts, and now is gone. That was the day I realized my skill wasn't just a party trick. It was a warning system. From then on, I paid even closer attention. I started keeping a mental log. I told myself it was just professional curiosity, but that was a lie. The truth was simpler and stranger. I liked knowing something that nobody else knew. The other footmen, the butlers, the ladies in waiting, they all watched her face, her hands, her eyes. But I watched her feet, and her feet never lied. Happy footsteps were light. The camellia walk. Top, top. Pause. Top, top, top. Those were the days she'd come back from the stables, smelling of horses and fresh air. Tired footsteps were heavy. Not angry, just slow. A long drag between steps, like each one cost her something. Those were the days after long meetings with politicians, the ones who talked too much and said too little. Worried footsteps were uneven. A quick step, then a slow one, then 2 quick ones, then a pause. Those happened during the bad years. The annus horribilis, they called it later. I remember standing in the corridor one night, past midnight, and hearing her walk back and forth in her private sitting room. Back and forth, for an hour. The uneven steps of someone trying to solve a problem that had no solution. But the footsteps that scared me most were the silent ones. Those were rare, maybe once or twice a year. She would appear at the end of the corridor without any warning, because her feet made almost no sound at all. Soft-soled shoes, maybe, or she was walking on the balls of her feet like a cat. Those were the days when something had gone terribly wrong. A death in the family. Bad news from the doctors. On those days, we didn't just bow. We tried to become invisible, because when the Queen walked silently, she was not the Queen. She was a woman carrying a weight so heavy that even her footsteps had learned to be quiet out of respect. I memorized all of it. Every pattern, every pause, every rhythm. And then, one day in early summer, something happened that tested everything I thought I knew. It was a Tuesday, the day of the Camellia Walk. Document 2 of 3 title. He memorizes the Queen's camellia footsteps so precisely he can tell her mood before she arrives. Part 2. The wrong rhythm, the roses were in full bloom. I remember that because the head gardener had left a cutting on the windowsill near my post, and the smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I'd been standing outside the 1844 room for about an hour, watching a spider build a web in the corner of the ceiling. It was that kind of afternoon. Quiet. Sticky. The kind where time moves backward. I was supposed to be watching for the Queen. She had a meeting at 3:15 with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Tea would be served. I was not the tea person. That was a higher rank than me, but I was the door person. My job was to open the door at the exact moment she arrived, then close it at the exact moment she entered, then stand outside and wait until she left. Simple. Boring. Perfect. At 3:07, I heard her. Top, top. Pause. Top, top, top. The camellia walk. Light. Musical. Happy. I allowed myself the smallest smile. Just a twitch at the corner of my mouth. Nobody saw it. The corridor was empty except for a single cleaner polishing a banister 50 feet away, and he was too far notice. She was about 30 seconds out. I could track her progress by the sound. Past the grand staircase. Past the portrait gallery. Past the door where the old footman, Gerald, had once fainted from standing too long and hit his head on a marble bust of King George III. He was fine. The bust was fine. Gerald's pride was not. 20 seconds. I reached for the door handle, ready to pull it open at the perfect moment. The timing had to be precise. Too early, and you looked eager. Too late, and you looked incompetent. The sweet spot was when she was exactly 4 feet from the door. That gave her just enough time to see the door opening, adjust her stride, and walk through without breaking rhythm. 10 seconds. Top, top. Pause. 5 seconds. Tap. The sound stopped. Not slowed. Not changed. Stopped. Abruptly. Like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. I froze. My hand was on the door handle, but I didn't pull. Something was wrong. The Queen did not stop walking in the middle of a corridor unless something had caught her attention. And she was still too far away for me to see her. A corner blocked my view. I listened. Silence. Then, very faintly, I heard her exhale. A long, slow breath. The kind you take when you're trying to calm yourself down. Then, the footsteps started again. But they were different now. Completely different. The camellia walk was gone. In its place was something I had never heard before. A hesitant step. A shuffle. Then, another hesitant step. Then a pause so long, I started counting in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She was nervous. The Queen of England was nervous. I felt a chill run down my spine, and not because the palace was drafty, although it was always, no matter how high they turn up the heating. No, this was a different kind of cold. The kind that comes from realizing you're about to witness something you were never meant to see. She rounded the corner, and there she was, Queen Elizabeth II, dressed in a pale pink dress and those same brown loafers. But her face was not the face I knew. She looked younger, somehow, more vulnerable. Her lips were moving slightly, like she was rehearsing words in her head. And her hands, I'd never noticed her hands before, were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I pulled the door open. She looked at me, really looked at me. Not the usual glance that passes through you, like you're made of glass. She looked at my face, at my eyes, and for one long, terrible second, I saw something in her expression that I still can't quite name. Fear? No, not fear. More like hope. A desperate, fragile hope that whatever was on the other side of that door would somehow fix everything that was broken. Then she looked away, walked through the door, and the door closed behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wood grain. The meeting with the Archbishop lasted 47 minutes. I know because I counted every single one of them. The door was thick, but not thick enough. I could hear murmurs. Not words, just tones. The Archbishop's voice was calm, soothing, like warm milk. The Queen's voice was barely audible. At one point, I thought I heard a sniff. But I told myself it was my imagination. When the door finally opened, the Archbishop left first. He nodded at me, a small, sad nod, and walked away without a word. Then the Queen came out. She was different. The tension in her shoulders was gone. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. And Her footsteps. I listened carefully. Her footsteps were soft. Not the silent footsteps of grief. Not the camellia walk of happiness. Something in between. Something I didn't have a name for. She paused next to me. Actually stopped. And she said, very quietly, "Thank you." Then she walked away. I never found out what they discussed. I never asked. But a few weeks later, I noticed something. The Queen's footsteps changed. Permanently. The camellia walk became rarer. The hesitant steps became more common. And there was a new pattern now, a pattern I came to think of as the resolution walk. Steady, even, a little slower than before, but more confident. The footsteps of someone who had made peace with something. I learned later that the Archbishop had been helping her through a personal crisis. Something involving a family member. Something that never made the newspapers, never became public, never got whispered about in the staff canteen. Whatever it was, she carried it alone. Except for that one afternoon in the 1844 room. And except for me, standing outside the door, listening to her footsteps change from fear to peace, one step at a time. But the real test came 6 months later. And that's when I almost lost everything. It was December. Freezing cold. The palace had that Christmas smell, pine needles, beeswax, and a faint hint of mince pies from the kitchens. I'd been promoted. Not much. Just enough to get a slightly better posting. I was now stationed outside the Queen's private sitting room on the first floor. A position of trust, which meant I was alone up there for most of the day with nothing but the ticking of a grandfather clock and the occasional scurry of a mouse. The Queen was supposed to be at Sandringham for the holidays. Everyone knew that. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. I was only there because someone had to answer the phones in case of an emergency. So when I heard footsteps at 11 p.m. on December 23rd, my first thought was that I was imagining things. Click, pad, pause. No, not imagining. Real and close. I stood up straighter. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single wall sconce that flickered every few seconds. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the staircase. Slow, deliberate, and wrong. Very wrong. The rhythm was off. The weight distribution was off. The pauses were too short, too sharp, like someone was trying to mimic the Queen's walk, but couldn't quite get it right. I reached for the panic button. Every footman had one, hidden in their jacket pocket. A small button that sent a silent alert to the protection officers downstairs. I had never pressed it, not once in 12 years. My finger hovered over the button. The footsteps got closer, and then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps were coming from the wrong direction. The Queen's private sitting room was at the end of a dead-end corridor. There was only one way in or out. If someone was walking toward the sitting room from the staircase, that meant they had come from downstairs. But the only people with access to this floor were senior staff and the royal family. And the royal family was supposed to be in Norfolk. I pressed the button. Then I stepped away from the door and positioned myself in the middle of the corridor, feet apart, hand behind my back. Standard defensive posture. If someone was coming to harm the Queen, and God, my mind was racing now, thinking about all those security briefings I'd half listened to, I was supposed to be a human obstacle. By time. Shout for help. Do something stupid and brave. The footsteps rounded the corner, and I almost laughed out loud. It was a woman. Tall, blonde, wearing jeans, and a Christmas jumper with a reindeer on it. She was carrying a suitcase in one hand and a sleeping bag in the other. And she was walking in high-heeled boots that clicked on the floorboards in a clumsy, uneven rhythm that bore almost no resemblance to the Queen's graceful gait. It was Princess Anne. She stopped when she saw me, raised an eyebrow. "You're still here." I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Royal Highness." I thought everyone was at Sandringham. She shrugged. "Changed my mind. Wanted to spend Christmas in London this year. Is Mother awake?" Before I could answer, the door to the private sitting room opened. The Queen appeared in the doorway, wearing a bathrobe and slippers. She looked at her daughter. She looked at me, standing there like a startled rabbit. And then she did something I had never seen her do before. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real laugh. A snorting, slightly undignified laugh that echoed down the empty corridor. "James," she said, still chuckling. "Did you just call security on my daughter?" I felt my face turn the color of a postbox. Your Majesty, the footsteps were. I thought, "You thought someone was impersonating me," she finished. She shook her head, but she was smiling. Actually smiling. "I knew you listened to my footsteps. I didn't know you'd memorized them well enough to spot an imposter." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, which was probably the right choice. Princess and looked between us, confused. "What's he talking about?" The queen put a hand on her daughter's arm. "I'll explain later. Come inside. It's cold out here." She glanced back at me. "You can cancel the security alert, James. And thank you for being vigilant." She closed the door. I stood there for a full minute, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Then I pulled out my phone, a privilege of the night shift, and texted the protection officer downstairs. False alarm. It was Princess Anne. The reply came 10 seconds later. "We know. Her car arrived 20 minutes ago. We tried to call you, but you didn't pick up." I looked at my phone. 3 missed calls. I had been so focused on listening to the footsteps that I hadn't heard the phone ringing in my pocket. Document 3 of 3 title. He memorizes the Queen's Camellia footsteps so precisely he can tell her mood before she arrives. Part 3. The last walk the years past. The footsteps changed. That's the thing about people. They think royalty is static, frozen in time like a portrait. But the Queen aged just like everyone else. Her footsteps aged too. The heel strikes became softer. The pauses became longer. The camellia walk appeared less and less until one spring I realized I hadn't heard it in over a year. I never asked why. Some questions don't need answers. By 2021, I was a senior footman. Not the most senior. There were always men above me, men who had been there since before I was born, but I had earned a certain respect. Younger footmen would ask me questions. How to pour wine without dripping. How to bow without looking like you were having a seizure. How to stand for 6 hours without fainting. And sometimes, if they were brave enough, they would ask me about the footsteps. "Is it true?" they'd whisper, usually in the staff canteen, over lukewarm tea and stale biscuits. "Can you really tell her mood before she arrives?" I never gave a straight answer. I just shrug and say, "She walks like a queen." That's all you need to know. But the truth was more complicated. By then, I could tell her mood from 50 yards away, through a closed door, in a howling wind. I could tell you if she'd slept well. I could tell you if she'd had an argument with someone. I could tell you, with terrifying accuracy, when she was about to make a difficult decision, because her footsteps would slow down just before she reached the door, as if she was giving herself one last chance to change her mind. It was a gift. It was also a curse, because knowing someone that well, someone who is not your family, not your friend, not even your acquaintance, creates a strange kind of intimacy, a one-way intimacy. I knew things about her that she would never know I knew, and that made me feel sometimes like a spy in my own skin. The last time I heard her footsteps was September 8th, 2022. I wasn't supposed to be working that day. I'd requested leave to visit my sister in Cornwall. But another footman had called in sick, and I was the only one with enough experience to cover his post. So I put on my uniform, straightened my tie, and reported for duty at 7 a.m. The palace felt different that day. Heavy. The kind of heavy that settles in your bones and makes you want to sleep for 1,000 years. The staff moved slowly, spoke quietly. Nobody said why. Nobody needed to. We had all seen the bulletins. The Queen was unwell. She had canceled her Privy Council meeting. She was staying at Balmoral. But we were in London, Buckingham Palace, and she was in Scotland, 300 miles away. I didn't understand why I was there. What was I guarding? An empty room? A silent corridor? I stood outside her private sitting room anyway, because that was my job, and because standing still was the only thing I knew how to do. The morning passed. The afternoon passed. The light through the windows turned from gold to gray. At 4 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from the master of the household. "Stay at your post. Do not leave for any reason." I didn't ask why. I just stood there. At 4:30, the palace went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. A different quiet. A waiting quiet. The kind of quiet that happens in hospitals, in hospice rooms, in the spaces between heartbeats. I closed my eyes, and I listened. Not for footsteps, there were none. The corridor was empty, the palace was empty, the whole city felt empty. But I listened anyway. I listened to the floorboards settling. I listened to the grandfather clock ticking. I listened to my own breathing, slow and steady, in and out. And then, very faintly, I heard something. Top, top, top. 3 soft taps, coming from somewhere far away. Somewhere not in this building, not in this city, not even in this country. Somewhere in my memory. The Camellia Walk. I opened my eyes. The corridor was still empty. The light was still gray. The clock was still ticking. But I had heard it, clear as day. Top, top. Pause. Top, top, top. Light. Musical. Peaceful. I smiled. I don't know why. I just smiled. At 6:30 p.m., the announcement came. The queen had died peacefully at Balmoral. The whole palace seemed to exhale at once, a collective sigh that rattled the windows and stirred the dust motes in the air. The other footmen cried. The housekeepers cried. The chefs put down their knives and stood in silence. Even the protection officers, those stoic, stone-faced men, had tears in their eyes. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there outside her empty room and listened to the silence where her footsteps used to be. And I thought about all those years, all those thousands of footsteps. Happy, sad, tired, worried, peaceful, angry, hopeful, resigned. A whole language written in heel strikes and pauses. A language that only I had bothered to learn. A language that was now extinct. They asked me to stay on after. The new king had his own household, his own routines, his own footsteps. But I couldn't do it. It wasn't about loyalty or grief or any of the things people expected. It was simpler than that. I had spent 12 years training my ears to hear one person, and I couldn't bear to train them to hear someone else. So I left. I moved to a small cottage in Kent, not far from the sea. I gardened. I read books. I learned to sleep through the night without dreaming of floorboards and door handles. But sometimes on quiet afternoons when the light is golden and the roses are in bloom, I close my eyes and I listen, and I still hear her. Top, top. Pause. Top, top, top. The Camellia Walk. Coming down the corridor. One last time.